Well, folks, it finally happened. George Russell brought his little brother to the podium for the first time. Yeah, and the two McLarens collided. But the Mercedes story is definitely the feel-good one. After a wobbly triple header, Mercedes are now back leading the constructors' charge behind McLaren. In fact, they even caught up by around 28 points. Yeah, I know, that's still massively, woefully behind the likes of McLaren. Toto will most definitely take it, because it does mean they've pulled away from the likes of Ferrari and especially Red Bull. And also, Toto, with George Russell winning like this against Max Verstappen, is this enough to get that contract over the line? George converted pole to win without really being challenged. Sure, he didn't pull off a Piastri or a Verstappen by getting 10 seconds down the road or anything like that. I mean, the safety car didn't help matters, but he still did enough to dictate the pace of the race and make sure that Max didn't really have a meaningful attempt in which to pull off a dive bomb and maybe take the win that way. Albeit that maybe Max Verstappen was being a little bit careful, especially after all the banter that George was saying on Saturday, saying, "Well, I have a few more penalty points to work with, so, we'll see what happens with the results." Oh, George, if only you had a championship-worthy car from the beginning, I think people would pay through the nose to see a Russell-Verstappen title battle. And what made this a fantastic weekend for George and the team is the fact that Kimi Antonelli got his first ever podium and did so with remarkably professional execution, because this wasn't just gifted to him, he earned this fair and square. He was excellent. He pinched third from Piastri at the start, didn't succumb to pressure from the championship leader, and he was even hounding Verstappen a couple of times. You could even argue that Kimi manipulated Red Bull's strategy, so that meant Max was kept away from him at all costs. And then on top of that, he soaked Kimi about 15 laps or so of pressure coming from Piastri behind him, and then Norris getting into the fray, and then in the midst of Nico praising to the heavens about Kimi, saying, "Oh yes, excellent, he was doing really well about seeing which one he would give a DR strike from, it was absolutely fantastic." Chaos ensued, as we know. Rosberg takes a selfie, we are all doomed. Toto described it as absolutely faultless, and Andrew Shovlin, according to the notes from F1.com, said that the tyres actually worked well, and seemingly a lot of the gremlins from the Imola upgrades are behind them. And not to mention, Kimi's promotion, more than justified. We've now got a podium before the halfway point of the season. And Max, I think he'll be fine with second place. It's most likely the best he could possibly have had, as he didn't win turn 1 and therefore could dictate the race pace, messing up with Russell's tyres. As a result, it meant that George could mess up Max's tyres a little bit, and we then got to see the likes of Verstappen pulling off an undercut to try and get ahead of Russell, and also stay away from the likes of Kimi Antonelli. It didn't work out, because then we heard out later on that Verstappen, like I think a few other of the drivers on the grid, was suffering from really bad rear tyre degradation. It went from the fronts to the rears, and that was not really as foreseen as many people thought. Only when the fuel burned away a little bit could Max go and maybe try and give it a go against George, but ultimately, the superior DRS of the Red Bulls was only enough to keep Kimi Antonelli from taking second place. Basically, Red Bull were calling this damage limitation. It was, as Max said, defensive, and that Christian Horner said they extracted everything from this weekend. But when you compare what they were able to get their rivals, Ferrari, 18 points, Red Bull were able to match them. Yes, Red Bull are still 4th place in the constructors, but nevertheless they aren't falling away even further, because Ferrari just seem to be in this middle no man's land sort of a thing, but we'll get to them later. And as for Max himself, it's actually pretty good for the World Championship, that he's actually managed to finish ahead of both McLarens, and yeah, he lost some points to Russell, but I don't think he's that fussed regarding George. It's mainly he wants to get some traction back against Oscar and Lando especially. Yeah, it's still over 40 points, but it's now closer to 40 than 50, and now, in terms of championship against Lando in second place, it's only 21 points instead of what we had before. And that is a little bit more manageable in trying to overcome. Definitely a morale booster for Max. He'll take second. Yeah, absolutely fine. And then we've got Alonso as a winner. Of all the places to hammer it home, it was the boss's son's race. The comment of Lance carrying the team are less potent after today, because Alonso's Sunday was pure experience over firepower. According to him, he let Lando go quite early, so that means he could focus on his lot. And ultimately, the Palmer karma rewarded him handsomely, in that effectively, he got that place he gave Lando back at the end of it, so he only ultimately lost that one place to Leclerc, going from P6 in qualifying to 7th in the race. That is still a valuable amount of points, 6 of them, so that means we are now getting closer to Fernando having double figures, and all will be right with the world. And P7, realistically, as Fernando said, that was the realistic ceiling for the team. That's the best they can probably hope for. And quite frankly, for Aston Martin, that'll do just fine. Just get some consistent 7ths, 8ths, 9ths every now and again. They are definitely not second to last. Alpine are very much holding the wooden spoon here. Aston Martin can just go, be gone with you! And also, Fernando is impressing upon the team to keep on updating the car, pointing out that the car has really good one-lap pace. Maybe, Adrian, you should have some more of those lunchtime conversations with the AMR25 group, if it can at least get them back into the midfield contention instead of falling away. So that means something going on. Because Fernando's finding some pace in this car, whereas Lance is simply not finding it, and they need as many points as they can get. And Nico Hülkenberg, welcome back to the winners section. They are, yeah, sure, back in second to last place, but they're actually closer to 6th anyway, because they're only 8 points behind Haas in 6th, and back-to-back points? Yeah, Hülkenberg did it again, perhaps showing that maybe the upgrades from Spain weren't a fluke, but the upgrades, they have legs. I remember audibly shouting to my partner that, yeah, Nico went from 13th or something to 9th within a couple of laps, and I was like, how did he get there? Nico's really finding something good with these upgrades, and yeah, Gabriel isn't as fortuitous, but at this point, Sauber will take every single point that they can get. And the thing about this, though, is that Nico's doing this in style. Yeah, the whole thing with Colapinto and Albon. Albon takes to the grass, Colapinto is compromised, Nico goes in the inside, out of the chicane, going like, I'll have that if you don't mind. Oh, opportunistic, sure. But for Sauber, who cares? Because he got through that off-roading section from Alex and then went long on the hard tyres for 45 laps and proved that these upgrades are not only potent in terms of speed, but also tyre longevity, that they could pull off one of those types of manoeuvres and actually be able to maintain that grip for a long period of time. Admittedly, more straight-line grunt is needed. The Ferrari power unit isn't the best in that regard compared to Mercedes and Honda and what have you. They're better than Renault, but they could do with a little bit more of that. But quite frankly, this is still a really strong showing, and that Nico still got something to show us all. And oh yeah, speaking of Bortoletto, I know it's still related to the Nico section, that, you know that Yuki Tsunoda got a 10-place grid penalty for overtaking under red flags. Gabi actually got hit by the same thing, but Sauber able to convince the stewards that, you know, there was nothing wrong with that. So another weekly win. And then we don't have a penalty for Ocon. Instead, we have a W, because Esteban Ocon is joining this list because he chose the road less travelled. He started on hard tyres, and he too proved that the jinx and curse of really poor tyre life that Haas had for the longest time up until a couple of years ago, oh, that's now very much in the past, because he managed to make those hard tyres last and pulled off the overcut in style. So that means for Haas's 200th Grand Prix, they got a couple of points, and they're now back in 6th place in the Constructors. It also vindicated Ayo Komatsu's call to split the strategies for Canada and confirmed that the VF25 is a really forgiving car. And Ocon's radio was really calm throughout the entire afternoon. It's a sign that he really feels home here, that he's building something at a place where he's actually heard, and that is a win in of itself. Now, Piastri does make the winners list here, and you might be calling me biased, but honestly, hear me out. His P4 felt more like a rescue mission than a bit of frustration. Yeah, of course, I must admit, losing 3rd place right at the start was not ideal. Kimi Antonelli simply just completely mugged him, and I am not ashamed to admit that. I saw throughout the entire weekend that Oscar was not really happy here, and I really do regret my predictions that he would go on to win the thing, because McLaren were just simply not on it. Neither he or Lando looked particularly comfortable. That they were mixing and matching upgrades, trying to find what was the best configuration. Oscar ultimately choosing the older front suspension configuration because it was something that he knew. The front wing didn't turn out to be all that much cop. I don't think he would have been ultimately, save for maybe a major coup in terms of the pit stops, getting past either George or Max. It was mainly like, yeah, okay, they've got this, but they're way behind me in the championship. Don't worry about them. Keep Lando behind me. Because it just really showed that even though Oscar's come on leaps and bounds, he really does have some issues regarding dirty air. That's probably his biggest weakness, quite frankly. And it didn't help that the late clash with Norris ripped off part of his diffuser and meant the stop behind the safety car for fresh tyres was vital to ward off any risks of a slow puncture. So you might be wondering why I'm giving him a win. Well, simple. Despite all of that, he still extended his championship lead to now 22 points. That is pretty much the only reason why he made the winners list. And most importantly, in terms of conduct and esteem amongst many fans, albeit those who are impartial or maybe not McLaren fans, Oscar pulled himself off quite admirably. He accepted the apology of Lando within minutes and on camera, so it's not just something that the PR team at McLaren could say happened we never saw, it was actually documented. The team thanked both Piastri and Norris for de-escalating it almost at once. Lando got on the radio and said that it was absolutely his fault, and we didn't see any angry expressions from either party, and yeah, good. It was just diffused within a matter of moments, like before the coverage had even completed. So that in of itself is still good. I could easily imagine that maybe behind the scenes it might be a little bit different, but to us all, it looks absolutely fine that they can walk back from this because it hasn't harmed McLaren and the constructors. But you got to admit, that racecraft up until that point, especially the turn 10 maneuver from Norris, which was really good in itself, the DRS drag down to the chicane, Oscar keeping his foot in on the inside, oh, that was fantastic. We need to see more of that, just less of that bit down the straight, that mirrored Button Hamilton 2011, okay? And yeah, if there was anyone to pin the blame at, to point the finger at, it would be McLaren for their papaya rule strategy absolutely and spectacularly failing, because them McLaren washing their hands of it and asking the drivers to deal with it didn't pan out that way. But again, that was less on Oscar and more on the pit wall. And then we get to the meh section, and you might be confused as to why Carlos didn't make the winner's circle, but it's the same old story we've heard from his side of the garage before, that it could have been so much more. You see, in the wake of Carlos being dunked out of Q1 due to impeding from Isaac Hadjar and what have you, missing out by 20 thousandths of a second, the Williams team decided to start long and do what Ocon did, start on the hards and then hope for the best and then see what they can do in salvaging some points. And sure enough, it did succeed. They converted 17th to 10th. 1 point is better than no point, sure, but afterwards what we heard from Carlos is that he was very much limited with multiple issues going around, not just in terms of communication. He was dealing with a fault that wasn't stated to the media that he had to manage, and then on top of that I think he had brake temperature issues as well, and then he had a couple of clashes. I think he had one with Ocon that ultimately no further action was taken in that regard. It wasn't a clean race from Carlos, but he did manage to make some progress. But you do see some frustration coming from the Spaniard in that maybe it could have been P9 if he didn't have to hold back so much, or better yet, had he actually gotten through to Q1, he might have made it further up Q2 or even into Q3 alongside Albon. That maybe there could have been some really valuable points here, since many people, myself included, were expecting this to be an absolute goldmine for Williams, as it had been the last couple of years. It's always been very kind, this track, to Williams, but not so on this occasion. That, yeah, sure, Williams have had a lot of uptick this season, but there's still much work to be done, especially in communication and all these very little things. But thankfully, they have been flagged by having two major league high-profile drivers, which means that James could do a little bit more smashy-smashy. And then we've got Ferrari. You might be thinking I'm just being mean here. Why were they not winners? Well, look to Friday. A weekend that began with Leclerc having no Friday to speak of through a self-inflicted smash into the barriers. It looked horrible to watch and just really amateurish. It meant that the onus was on Hamilton to lead the charge, and whilst he did well to get the car on the third row, that potential fizzled out come the race, albeit only slightly. But one thing was for sure, there was no real chance of Ferrari securing themselves a podium, even though for a brief stint Leclerc was leading the race, and Hamilton's fight back, him being the leading Ferrari in qualifying, was then curtailed around lap 13 or so when he hit a groundhog, and I really hope it wasn't Mr. or Mrs. Hog or anything like that. It did result in Lewis sustaining some damage yet again, like he did in Spain, which then meant he really couldn't make any more of a charge, and he was once again vastly behind those ahead of him, the top five. Indirectly, Vasseur was saying that a lot of little things that came up throughout practice really reared their ugly heads come the race, and one of the big factors was the fact that they didn't really have a car worth speaking of throughout Friday, that they missed out on so much data, so indirectly, he was Fred blaming Charles. But ultimately, what keeps them from being losers is that despite all of that, Leclerc did recover back to P5 because, well, Lando crashed out, which afforded them a couple of more points, 4 more, and therefore it meant that they scored the same amount of points as Red Bull did, so they didn't lose any ground in terms of falling away from P3. Yeah, Mercedes did bank a huge chunk of points in comparison, but you know what? I'll throw Ferrari a bone here. They managed to get something, decent points, and double points. And then I'm going to put Yuki Tsunoda in the miss section as well, and you might be thinking I'm off my absolute rocker here. Why on earth is he a meh here? He should be a loser because he got himself a 10-place grid penalty for overtaking under red flags. That is very true. But Yuki's defense of that and justification was definitely very valid and sound, because it was all to do with overtaking Piastri when the red flags came out, because the Australian hit the wall of champions and he was spewing forth debris from the wheel rim. So, understandably, Yuki wouldn't want to get in the way of debris, because remember what happened when Massa was behind Barrichello and that spring hit him in the head? So surely Tsunoda would just want to, well, not be behind it in case something more came out of the way and then donked him on the bonds. But either way, the stewards didn't take too kindly of that, Red Bull once again missing the presence of Wheatley, who might have been able to talk them out of that penalty. So it meant that he was pretty much on firefighting mode and starting P18. Red Bull gambled on the long form like Sainz and Ocon did, starting on hard tyres, hoping for the best, but ultimately Yuki couldn't really convert as much as he would have liked, because we did succumb to the DRS train, which is known to have happened here and did affect many other drivers who were hoping for a fight back of their own. And he also admitted the safety car timing didn't help, so he finished 12th. Are there any positives to be had here? Yeah, actually. His car was identical to Max's once more, and those upgrades brought him back into line for the first time since Imola. And Tsunoda described the raw pace of the car with Max's spec as okay in clean laps, but tyre warm-up on the C6 still bit him at least a little bit. There is a little bit more progress to be had, and if he can score at Red Bull's home race in Austria, which I will be attending by the way, so if you do see me, come up and say hello, I do feel like maybe Yuki can be able to salvage something, and hopefully Red Bull can mount a decent defence against Ferrari to at least salvage P3 in the Constructors. That is Yuki's goal this season. Try and save P3. And then Franco Colapinto. This was much more like it. Definitely the stronger of the two Alpine cars this weekend, and at a track he'd never raced at before to boot. Because starting 10th looked like he made a breakthrough, a very timely one considering that Friday looked very shaky. But sadly for the Argentinian, it all fell apart in the race, and I believe his first stop was a little longer than necessary, which meant he fell back behind other people. He then succumbed to a DRS train, which meant that he was going absolutely nowhere. It really didn't help that Albon was really defending hard against him, and yeah, Alex took to the grass, but it did compromise Colapinto, which then meant Hulkenberg could sweep past both of them, which meant that Franco was already in P11, and then he would have to do the business in terms of other strategies to try and get that 10th place back again. I was preparing my pint of cola, I was really thinking it was going to happen, but ultimately it didn't come to pass, because on top of that, this being a power circuit, and the Renault very much lacking in power, the Renault team didn't have a leg to stand on. They would have to rely on daring deeds and desperate braking maneuvers and strategy to get past people. As you can tell that they didn't. So yeah, he ultimately finished P13. It wasn't a reflection on his potential throughout the weekend, because it was really, really good. He was really solid here. Pierre didn't really have much to talk about this weekend, whereas Franco was repping the team, and he was so close to getting to Q3. It was remarkable. And I did see this potential kind of in Spain for qualifying. I think he would have made Q3, potentially, had the car not bugged out on him before Q1 finished. And Franco said that he actually has found some pace in the car and that maybe the momentum can continue. And I think Flavio will take very kindly to this, because he did spend a lot of money in securing the talents of this kid from Williams, and it will certainly give him a lot of points because he was being competitive. It's just the car's overall pace and strategy was his undoing. And then we have Behrman. According to Haas, they split strategies, and it was Behrman who drew the short straw. Starting on mediums, the conventional one, put him behind slower hard tyre runners so the younger spent 2/3 of the race in the DRS train. Not much you can do there. But Free Air did offer him an opportunity to get some competitive times in, and he ultimately finished 11th and just outside the points. Yet the best thing about all of this is that Oliver isn't downbeat or anything like that. He has once again said that he likes the car, that there is something to be had here, that there is pace, that he can work with it, which is a really optimistic viewpoint and can easily be a justification for Haas to still mount a challenge for P6, because Esteban's on song, Oliver's not perturbed throughout missing on points yet again. It's just a case of doing better in qualifying, because he and Ocon propped up the Q2 timesheets. They need to push on a little bit more, so that means Behrman doesn't have to do nearly as much work and he doesn't get stuck in traffic. And then Gabi looked fairly decent too, but his gamble on an early safety car achieved nothing. They do happen around here, safety cars, but that car did not arrive until 15 laps too late than Sauber would have liked, despite decent pace on fresher rubber. Not much else to say really. Gabi did absolutely fine. He narrowly missed out on Q2 by I think 5,000ths of a second. It was even closer than Carlos missing out on Q2 was. And it just shows that on Saturday he is getting closer to Nico, so there might be some more going for him. So I will definitely say that this was okay, especially around a track he had never raced at before, much like, well, every other rookie. And again, at least he's in good hands with the stewards, because Bortoletto has Wheatley there, and Wheatley is like that with the stewards. Now, okay, I thought long and hard about this, but Lando, I'm sorry. you are not only just a loser this weekend, but I am going to have to send you to the dark bit. Rule 1 at McLaren is easy. Don't hit the other car. On lap 67, Norris hit the other car, clipping Piastri's left rear on the run to turn 1 after falling short on a dual DRS run down to the final chicane. The contact sapped his front suspension, dumped him into the wall, and a trip to the steward's office in regarding to causing a collision, which got 5 seconds added to his overall race time. But since he was still classified, it won't carry over to Austria. But let me make this absolutely clear. Lando owned it. He owned it immediately. It was not anyone else's fault but his. But I think the damage has gone a little bit deeper, and it will manifest itself in the weeks and months to come. That psychologically, Oscar's beaten him solidly. This was racecraft. This was a no-holds-barred, equally measured DRS run all the way to the end, and Lando lost out. And Oscar didn't really have to do much. And in terms of the championship run, Lando just simply wasn't thinking, because Papaya Rules was saying that he would have to be the one to pass Oscar. McLaren were not getting involved whatsoever. If it meant that he would have to settle for finishing behind Oscar, he would have only lost 2 points, still 12 points, behind the likes of Piastri, but still not all that bad, considering that at the start of the race, it was likely he was going to lose 9 of them. So going from 9 to 2, not too bad in terms of damage limitation, thinking of the bigger picture. But no, instead of losing 2 points to his teammate, he's now lost 12. 22 points behind the Australian, almost a full race win. Not ideal, and like I touched upon earlier, Verstappen is closer to him now than Norris is close to Piastri. Luckily for Norris and McLaren, the flashpoint did not result in drama between the drivers, although I think away from the cameras, I think that tempers will be more heated. But in front of the camera, Stella spoke of it as a simple miscalculation, praising Norris's accountability in the heat of the moment, when tempers could understandably be short. Yes, I've heard many times the infamous Senna quote, that one, about saying if you don't go for a gap, then you're not a racing driver. You just felt like, well, Lando simply misjudged the timings, in that had it been maybe a second or two more, that might have worked out, Oscar might have had to back out, or simply, why didn't he just try with that speed differential, go around the outside? He might have been able to swoop past him then. But nevertheless, in terms of a championship fight, it's not going to help. It's going to give Oscar more ammunition, and if Lando hopes to gain more control back from the team, then he's got another thing coming. I think he's not done himself any favours at all. But then why didn't McLaren make the call to allow the swap, and then maybe Lando would give the place back if he couldn't get past Antonelli? But I recall the situation at Imola, where Lando had to get past Oscar himself, and ultimately he lost out in trying to pass Verstappen. But it was down to the fact that Stella didn't make the call because he didn't believe from the data that Lando had enough pace to actually get past Max, so it would have been a fruitless exercise. Did we get the same thing here? That maybe the pit wall looked at the data and Lando simply didn't have the meat on his tyres to actually get past Kimi since Mercedes were looking so strong? That's why they were silent? Maybe. And they don't really care which of their drivers wins the drivers' one. Just let them figure it out. McLaren, they don't want to be responsible for that. But I do think maybe focus could shift onto Piastri more than Norris at this time. And then the losers proper. The red flag in Q1 hit Gasly hard, after not finding the right temperature on the C6s when the session resumed. It ultimately led to Gasly starting from the pit lane after starting at the back, so they could maybe make some changes. And then he went for a one-stopper, and that only worsened the pain. And it gave Franco a much-needed boost in terms of his long-term or even medium-term, heck, short-term survival in Formula 1, because out of the two Alpine drivers, Colapinto was the stronger. Easily. Without question. And he had absolutely no idea what was going on. Gasly calling for much changes to be made here, and to figure out what on earth happened, which made him completely averse from scoring any points. And all this proves now is that Alpine is definitely the backmarker team. I get the wooden spoon, but I chucked it so far early I can't quite reach it. So you're just going to have to imagine a spoon here. And on top of that, Alpine's straight line deficit meant that there was not really much chance of a decent fight back, especially with a one-stopper, which means you'd have to nurse the tyres. It was just a complete comedy of errors, which meant that, well, Sauber have pulled away from them. They're now 9 points ahead of Alpine Sauber. That's nuts. So yeah, not a great day for Gasly, and I'm pretty sure that Briatore is not going to be really looking kindly at the Frenchman. And you might be thinking I'm being unfair to Pierre, but he is the team leader here. That's why he's still knocking around. So expectations will be even stronger than they are for the rookie. And pressure is also coming to Lance Stroll, because his home advantage yielded nothing for the first time in his career. Yeah, there was a DNF in 2018, but this time around, with Lance being classified, he was pointless. The weekend turned sour especially when he forced Gasly onto the grass and got a 10-second penalty. The AMR25 already lacked bite on heavy fuel, and the ideal narrative of Lance returning from injury to score like he did a couple of years ago, yeah, that wasn't going to happen. And penalty aside, Lance then reported that he struggled with the car, that it had no pace, which is incredibly worrying for Aston Martin because you looked at what Fernando Alonso was capable of doing in both qualifying and the race. He had all the pace. Yeah, you could maybe blame the injury, that reports of Lance wincing getting in and out of the car might have been accurate and representative as to why he didn't get a chance at a point, but then Lance was claiming that it wasn't an issue throughout that entirely really bizarre chewing gum and fluff press conference I talked about on Friday, so therefore, well, okay, it's not the issue then, so, well, what is it? Are these upgrades that Aston Martin have produced just not working with Lance? And then you're going to have so many people at Aston Martin looking at this and saying, is this really the guy that we want to have knocking around next to Fernando next year? But regardless whatever narrative you choose, it's not a good look, especially at the other home race of Aston Martin. And then Isaac Hadjar. This was a weekend where his points run came to a screeching halt. Losing 3 places also due to impeding sights in Q1, it meant lost momentum and track position, which for a midfield team would have been immensely valuable as the only person ahead of them would have been Leclerc. And that would have been understandable. Also, Hadjar reported of extremely high graining on the medium tyre, which meant that when he got stuck behind a DRS train, there wasn't really much that he could do. And then the old bugbear of racing bulls, in terms of strategy, reared its ugly head, with Isaac admitting that he was pitted a little too late. Therefore, he lost more positions, which added to the pain, which meant that Isaac didn't really have much of a chance of capitalising on the 12th place. That's perfectly understandable. He had such a huge tear in this last few races, scoring so many points in his rookie year. It's still something commendable. He certainly gave it a try at a track that he's never raced at before. It just simply wasn't to be. He had an off day. You know, it happens. But at least, he was still able to run rings around the likes of Liam Lawson, even though the Racing Bull cars were simply not on it today. He looked very much off the boil. A change of power unit meant a pit lane start, but that didn't really help anything, especially since the real blown came down later due to a cooling issue that meant he had to retire the car. And his body language throughout just told of a weekend where just nothing clicked. It's a shame really, because Liam looked actually reasonably planted in the Racing Bulls. Monaco was a nice little turning point where he actually started to score some points. It looked like also in Spain he narrowly missed out on some of his own. It just means the momentum has suddenly stopped. That qualifying 19th, having no idea as to why, it was just... I think the red flag really didn't help matters, and therefore he just couldn't make any momentum in the race as well. DRS trains aplenty. But I would argue probably the most haggard-looking driver throughout the entire weekend was that of Alex Albon, lawn-mowing some grass not once, but at least twice. And really does go to show that, like I mentioned with Carlos's section, that Williams, they're doing really well this year, really absolutely splendiferously well, but there are still some weaknesses to be had, and it also came to do with communication. That, yeah, he did get into Q3, Alex, albeit propping the timesheets, but the entire weekend looked really shoddy for both he and the team. Various issues befalling them, and then Alex really losing his temper about the team not communicating properly once again. No strategy, which meant that he had to go alone. Seriously, this is a really major red flag here. The team needs to address this, because this kind of execution could easily cost them a championship bid if the car comes good, the FW48. And last year we had some of these problems as well, but with them locked to 9th place, we didn't really care as much. They're 5th now. They are now seeing many other teams in the midfield starting to regain some momentum, and this was a track which we all expected Albon to get at least another P7 at. And he was kind of close in terms of qualifying, but then his altercation with Franco didn't help matters, and then the one-stop attempt, yeah, that didn't work out, so Albon just looked frustrated. And then on top of that, the power unit thing came around again, which meant that he had to retire, but this time around he didn't make it to the pit lane, so he ultimately had to park it. Yeah, there's still work to be done, but it's just sad to see this kind of performance after the really good run that we'd seen at the beginning of the season. Yeah, it's sad really. But going back to our race winner for a moment, the lack of a contract for next year and beyond looks increasingly confusing. George admitting mild impatience himself concerning the matter. To find out why this could leave the door open for a surprise move maybe to Aston Martin, because the team has admitted that George is on their radar, watch this video next, straight after this one.